Welcome to Falcon Repair. Today we're going to replace the CV axle on a 2008 Ford Escape. This should be the same process for the 01 through 17 Ford Escape, Mazda Tribute, and Mercury Mariner. Okay, to get started, we have the vehicle jacked up with a 2.5 ton jack. We have a jack stand in place to keep it from settling, and we have the wheel removed. We have access to the brake caliper now, and we need to be able to get to 2 bolts on the backside using an 18mm socket. This is a lot easier if we turn the steering wheel all the way to the right. You can see now I have a lot better access to get to the backside where those 2 18mm bolts are. Now we have plenty of room to get a 1/2 inch breaker bar connected to an 18mm socket to the back side of the caliper to loosen the 2 bolts. Once you break them free, they should be easy enough to then remove by hand. Once we have the caliper loose, we can hang it out of the way using this special bracket. Once we've removed the caliper, we can hang it from the coilover shocks using our little bracket. And now the rotor should come off very easily by simply grabbing a hold of it, sliding it off, and now we have access to our wheel hub assembly. I like to use these magnetic trays as I go to organize the nuts and bolts and parts that come off. That way they're a lot easier to find when you need to put things back together. We need to remove the speed sensor and get it out of the way, and to do that we need an 8mm socket. Once you've got the little nut out, the speed sensor itself comes out not too difficult. The other side was a little harder. It's got kind of like little flared out plastic tabs at the end, and it needed a little more persuasion on the other side, but this one came out just fine. While we're undoing the speed sensor connections, there's a bracket on the side of the shock mount that requires a 10mm. To undo the nut that holds the CV axle spline up into the wheel hub assembly, you need a 32mm socket. And once again, the 1/2 inch breaker bar makes pretty easy work of this. On some vehicles, if you want to remove the CV axle, all you got to do is remove the nut on the end of the spline, holding it into the wheel hub assembly, and then you can turn the wheel all the way one direction or the other and bump out that spline, get the CV axle to kind of compress on itself, and then you can get it free out the back side of the hub assembly. On this Ford vehicle, I have not had luck with that. I've done this about 4 times, and you have to undo at least the top 2 bolts holding it into the shock bracket, and then lean it out away from the vehicle, being very careful with it not to tear up that ball joint assembly. Lean it out away from the vehicle to be able to get the CV axle spline out of it. So the next thing we're going to do is remove the 2 bolts that hold the wheel hub assembly to the lower part of the shock strut assembly, and it's going to require 18mm sockets or wrench, whatever you're using. One of my favorite things I use on stuff like this is my 20-volt DeWalt impact driver. That was one-handed. Now for the lower bolt, while I try to hold the camera and a wrench in the other hand. Love that thing. And as you can see, we're slowly filling up our magnetic plates as we go. And it makes it much nicer when you come back later and are looking for those little piecey parts to get everything back together. With the upper bolts removed and the tie rod removed, I can now lean the whole knuckle assembly forward, as you can see, and I can bump the spline backwards gently, and I should be able to remove the whole CV axle without having to undo the lower ball joint. If you can avoid that at all, I highly recommend it. Now we have this end of the CV axle removed from the knuckle assembly, and we have to get the other end of the CV axle pried off of an intermediate shaft that comes out of the transmission. From underneath the vehicle we can see how the CV axle comes down and then the other end goes into an intermediate bearing. There's no bolts holding it in there, it's just slid up on actually another shaft, and we have to pry it off of there. That other shaft is an intermediate shaft that then goes over and plugs into the transmission. Only the right side has this intermediate shaft. Now we have the CV axle off, and it took a little bit of persuasion with a 4-pound hammer tapping on a pry bar, and I had the other end of the pry bar nestled up under this cog area where you can see the scratches. But it wasn't too difficult to get off. Now you can see the shaft sticking out of the intermediate shaft that it was slid up on top of. And once again, no bolts, you just have to persuade it to come off of there. The cheapest price I found was on Amazon, and I'll provide a link to this part number at the end of the video. Before you install the new CV axle, be sure to spread a little fresh axle grease up in the other end where it slides onto the spline of the intermediate shaft.
Just a bit.
Now we've tightened back the nut on the end of the CV axle, holding the end of the spline into the knuckle assembly and the hub assembly with a 32mm socket attached to my 1/2-inch ratchet. It is very snug. We've now reattached the knuckle assembly using 18mm socket and wrench on both sides. We've reattached the tie rod in the castellated nut with a cotter key underneath, and we've reattached the bracket for the speed center using a 10mm socket, and then we've reattached the speed sensor itself using an 8mm socket. I've gone ahead and purchased new brake pads and rotors for the vehicle, and I've positioned the rotor with a couple of lug nuts, so we're ready to reinstall the brake caliper, which is hanging out of the way. And before we do, we'll put new brake pads into the caliper. With a new pad in place on the caliper side, I need to compress it slightly using a C-clamp. We don't necessarily need to bottom out the caliper, but we do need to compress it possibly 1/4 of an inch to 1/2 an inch to get it to fit on to the new rotor, since all of the tolerances will be tighter compared to the worn out brake pads. I've now put the new caliper on with the new brake pads, positioned it on the rotor, and I've finger tightened the bolts on the back side. So now I just need to get a 1/2 inch wrench with my 18mm socket and tighten those two bolts up. Well, it's all back together, and we've tightened all the bolts. Got the brake line back in place, the speed sensor's back in place, tie rod end back in place, and we're ready to put the tire on. Once you've double checked that everything's tight, you can reinstall the wheel and lower the vehicle back down. Be sure and depress the brake pedal several times after you start the vehicle to get the new brake pads to seat up on the rotor. It takes 3 or 4 times until you'll get a firm brake pedal. Be sure to click on the links below this video to get the latest prices on the CV axle that we replaced, or brake caliper hangers, rotors and brakes, shock strut assembly, or the wheel hub knuckle assembly. Thanks for watching this short video on replacing the CV axle on a Ford Escape. Be sure and subscribe to the channel Falcon Repair to catch more videos on repairing this vehicle and others.